Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here in my session. I'm Andrea Barizani from a company called InversePath, and I come here to talk to you about our digital hardware project that we named the USB Armory. So just to give you a little bit of background on who I am and the kind of public research that we've done in the past. So we work a lot with software as well as hardware. So we do a lot of security on embedded systems. A few years ago, we did talk about car hacking over FM radio with the traffic message channel information hijacking. We did a more exotic talk about sniffing keystrokes with Tempest attacks from the power line and so on. In 2011, we were one of the first two groups to do security on chip and pin and credit cards. And 2 years ago, we did talks on packet-in-packet on Ethernet injection. So these are kind of, we always try to focus on, some kind of exotic hardware aspect in our public research when doing security. And last year, we decided to build something for a change instead of destroying things, which is always nice and very rewarding when you actually get to build something. And so we decided to do this open source project called the USB Armory, which is basically putting a full-blown computer with some security capabilities, which I'm going to discuss, on a form factor of a USB stick. So we're talking about something which is absolutely small and portable. So why did we try to take on this endeavor and to build this thing? So the very first concept for building such a device was to have open source encryption on a USB device. Because, you can buy some USB drives which have some proprietary encryption from some vendor, which they will tell you that they're going to encrypt your files in some way. But of course, we know that encryption which is not open source is not to be trusted. And these kind of devices, they can always be broken, and they basically provide no guarantee of anything. So the idea was to have something which can be open source, both in terms of hardware and software, and allow a transparent way to encrypt files on an external device. And once we thought about this idea, and once we slowly realized that it would be nice to just have a full computer on a USB drive, then more possibilities came up, such as having, OpenSSH client running on the device itself, having VPN tunneling, and so on. So, and the mass storage that we talk about is, we call it enhanced mass storage. So the capability of having some kind of arbitrary computer on such a small device that can run your code opens up a lot of possibilities. So for instance, why not having some kind of mass storage device which not only will encrypt your data with PGP or whatever you want, but it will also scan it for malware before actually storing on the micro SD card, which is on the device. So that was one of the ideas. And the idea started with emulating mass storage over USB, which is a normal protocol which you talk over your USB flash drive. But since we think of a device that can emulate any USB device, we could just show up as an Ethernet card and then have a web application which allows to do all of this kind of functionality, but with an additional layer of authentication. Because if you simply emulate a mass storage device, then you will just see the file system and you cannot authenticate to your key. And this would also allow us to do more rich functionality from a web application, such as uploading files somewhere and things like that. This, of course, opens up other possibilities, such as acting upon custom conditions that you can define, since the code that runs on the USB device is your own and can be arbitrary. So you could, for instance, decide to wipe everything that's on the device if a certain password is being entered or if a certain condition raises. It could be used if you would have this network connectivity from the device. You can use it for SSH proxy. So if you plug into a computer which you don't trust or you don't want to have your SSH keys on your laptop, for instance, you can then connect to the USB device and then from the USB device connect out, because emulating TCP/IP functionality over USB means that you can route it and it can access the internet and so on. So it can be a proxy for all of these kind of things. It could be a password manager. Why not? Since you have the capability of doing encryption and running web applications on it, you can be any kind of password managers that you would like. It could be an authentication token for one or more protocols, and so on. So you get the idea. And there's one also other interesting feature about having this kind of device, that you can program the USB device to authenticate your host, which is something that so far I don't think we've ever seen. So you can have a device that, since it runs custom code, it can decide to act in different ways depending if the connected host is trusted or not. So you can show, I don't know, pictures of cats if the device is not yours, and then your super secret documents are only shown if your laptop is being connected. So things like this, which are simply not doable with single-purpose, proprietary specific USB devices. So all of these possibilities, which they all spawn from one single idea, we felt, this is a device that we would like to use. So we decided to develop it. And we set by the very beginning a few design goals in order to make something like this a reality. So it needs, of course, to be a compact USB power device, so no external power supply. A USB host needs to provide enough power to power it up. We wanted it to be a little future-proof, so fast CPU and a generous amount of memory. We don't like well, we do like, but for this specific application, we don't think a single-purpose specific device tailored for one use in terms of performance, it's something that would be a good choice. We think it should be something that allows to expand its functionality depending on what the user wants to do with it. It must have secure boot. This is, of course, a very important prerequisite. I mean, we need to provision the hardware in a way that only your code gets ever executed on that single unit. Otherwise, you can just swap the micro SD card or whatever storage that you have with another and do other functionality without you knowing. It needs to provide standard connectivity over USB, so TCP/IP ideally. And really important, it needs to have a developing environment which is familiar. There are a lot of embedded systems where maybe if you're lucky you get a Linux distribution for it, a Linux kernel which is heavily patched by the vendor, so it's always out of date and it's not a very comfortable developing environment. So we wanted this thing to run stock Linux, without too much trouble. And of course, open design, which means both in terms of software as well as hardware, everything needs to be as open as possible. So the first and most important thing while taking on on a project like this is selecting the system on a chip that you're going to use as your processor. In our case, we chosen the Freescale IMX53 for a few reasons. So first of all, it's a powerful ARM Cortex A8 core, so it can be clocked between 800 to 1.2 gigahertz, depending on 800 megahertz, 1 to 1.2 gigahertz, depending on the specific model that we have, which I think it's pretty fast for a USB dongle. Almost every datasheet and manual is public, so especially the one for secure boot is public, so there's no NDA required, which we think it's important. The datasheets are okay. They're not great. They're better than other vendors, a little worse than others, but they're okay, so that's good. It provides supports for ARM Truston, which I'm going to discuss about later on. It has secure boot and secure storage and secure RAM for dedicated cryptographic operations. There's a detailed power consumption guide available, which was very important for us into assessing if we would actually be able to power this thing from USB only. And very important is an excellent native support. So we can run Debian, Ubuntu, FreeBSD, and Android stock with no modification required. And there's a good stock and production support guarantee. You don't want to commit to a design and then figure out like a few weeks after that maybe your part goes out of life and you cannot produce it anymore, because that sucks and you waste a lot of time in the process. So knowing that there's good stock for this specific system on a chip also weighs heavily on the choice. It is a fairly complete system on a chip. It has 80% of things that we don't use at all for this purpose. We have CAN bus controllers, LCD display controllers, a lot of things that we just don't use. But it also has the features that we want for this specific device. And it features Truston with an implementation which is actually well done. So what is Truston? So Truston is a technology that you find on pretty much every modern ARM core, which allows you to create an additional domain separation between the so-called non-secure and secure world. So traditionally on an ARM processor, you have your user mode applications, you have your privilege mode, which is where let's say the Linux kernel lives, and that's basically the separation that you can have between user space and kernel space. With Truston, you have an additional level which basically duplicates all of that into the secure container. So we have another user mode and another privilege mode, which are different than the non-secure related modes. And there's a monitor mode which allows to switch from one area to the other by executing one instruction, which is a secure monitor call. And the interesting thing about Truston is that not only you separate the execution context of the CPU, but you can also decide to assign individual hardware subcomponents only to the secure world if you want. So you can have device drivers which are implemented for certain components, and you decide which ones these are, only in the secure domain. And you can force the non-secure world to switch to the secure world in order to use these devices. Otherwise, they have no visibility whatsoever on the actual hardware peripheral. So this allows you to, let's say, have the Ethernet controller or the USB controller or the microSD controller confined just to the secure domain. And the idea is that you keep a rich OS in the normal world, let's say an Android system or a Linux system, so something which has a larger attack surface. And you put very minimal code or a microkernel into the secure world that handles one very specific security-sensitive task which you want to protect. And the reason for doing this is that a compromise of the normal world, which has a bigger attack surface, would not expose the secrets that are being held into the domain of the secure world. Because the hardware which the secure world is handling, it's not simply cannot be accessed from the normal world. And also the memory and the execution context are completely separate. So unless there is a error in the implementation between the intra-world communication, then those two domains are completely separate. I'm going to explain a little in detail how to leverage on Truston. So once we set these goals, so we wanted to use Truston, we wanted to use this specific system on a chip and so on, we decided to develop the schematics for this board in March of last year. There's a long process since we did this in our spare time along our daily jobs. The process was basically went from a very first alpha board to a set of beta boards that allow us to find exactly the production unit that we wanted to make in large numbers. And this process went from March of last year until the end of the year. So we were able to go from schematics development to first production in, let's say, little less than 9 months. And we just began shipping of these units. It is completely open source, so the hardware, the schematics are completely open. They're all made in KiCad, which is an open source electronic design tool. We thought it was important not only to make the design open, to release them under our open license, but also to make them accessible to people that are into open source hardware. Of course, if you publish a design in a commercial software, it costs, I don't know, $20,000. That's not really accessible to most people. So we use an open source design software specifically for this. And also the actual software that we're publishing, the applications for this device, they're also open source. we put the IMX53 on it. It's completely USB host power. We put a micro SD card slot for storage. We have an LED, which can be assigned only to Truston, which we use for secure mode detection. So it's a nice way to use Truston and show that if the LED goes on, actually the secure word is taking over. So if a password is being prompted in that specific time and the LED is on, for instance, you know that Truston is being executed. So it's kind of nice to have this kind of feedback. We put a breakout header so that GPIOs, serial port, SPI, I2C are broken out. And again, we managed to match our design goal to run native Linux on it. So Debian and Ubuntu, for instance, can run without any modification whatsoever. And it can be used for any kind of USB device emulation. Now, there's an interesting thing. While we initially planned this device to be used in device mode, it can also be used in host mode, so in a completely standalone mode. So here you can see that by creating a female-to-female connector, USB connector, we can plug a keyboard, a mouse, a hub, a wireless card, and a USB display, and we can just use it as a completely standalone computer, which is now browser on a completely random page on the internet right there. And so at the very beginning, we thought we couldn't do this because we drive the ID pin of USB to the ground because we didn't think that this could actually be possible. But the USB controller on the system on a chip doesn't care about that. We can just politely ask to it to be in host mode, and it will happily be in host mode. And we developed a female-to-female connector that just bridges the two ports, and this allows you, in combination with the micro USB port, to provide power. So you can power the USB Armory, and then you can attach any USB peripheral on the other side. So in this example, we just attach wireless to the device. So in completely standalone mode, which we think is kind of cool because then you can take it out and then you can also plug it in a laptop and use it as a device. So it's up to you. So I would like to talk about a little bit about the actual development process that went on into doing this kind of hardware. So one of the challenges, the main challenge into doing this kind of hardware is that it is not really easy or almost impossible most of the times to prototype this hardware on your own. And one of the main reasons for this is not only the size of the components and the density of the components, but also the fact that you're dealing with BGA components such as the system on a chip and the RAM. So BGAs have a package where they have all of these tiny balls underneath that they're actually used for soldering, and it's not very easy to solder that on your own. You can, but it's a very tedious process, and you end up making a lot of mistakes. So it's definitely not ideal. So one of the things that we thought of, we said, let's try to be smart about this. We wanted to develop a breakout box for the system on a chip. So a board that would allow us to break out every one of those little balls so that then we can power up the system on a chip and do prototyping in the conventional way without the DDR memory. That actually is not strictly required when doing prototyping, because we can either use the internal memory or other ways anyway to push our code on it. So when you deal with BGA, so what you do, you have a so-called fan-out patterns where you just have, so all of the red dots there, they match the actual ball, which is going to land on the board. And then at 45 degrees angle on each quadrant, we just put a so-called via, which is basically like a through hole which goes through the entire PCB, which then allows you to put a trace. So in this case, we develop a board where all of these BGA balls are just broken out with traces that then go to external pin headers that we can just access. And to not risk making the wrong soldering on the board, we also acquire a custom socket that allows us to clamp the system on a chip without actually soldering on the board. So just with the right pressure, you have a torque precision screwdriver, and then you put the sock on it, and then you can access all the single pins or pads of the system on a chip. Now, this felt like a very good idea at the time, but lessons learned, number one, it was actually completely useless. And one of the reasons, this is why we have Darth Vader, which, killed the Admiral, because he failed him for the last time. And this is actually what I did when we saw that we couldn't get this done. So after several attempts of soldering by hand the power components for powering up the system on a chip, we realized that the tolerances for actually having stable power rails from the power regulator to the system on a chip are so high that it was almost impossible for us to just solder this on our own. We needed an actual PCB for doing this. And if you need a PCB for the power component, then you might as well put the sock on the same PCB, and then you might as well put the memory on the same PCB. So we realized that it was just best to just go and prototype the real thing, on a real PCB and having a sample. So this effort was actually, the effort of being smart was actually kind of useless. So this is like a superstar destroyer, something expensive, big, but it's a big piece of junk that nobody wants. The other thing that made us, lose a little time is using open source software for actually making the board, which I think it's pretty amazing that we can do something like this nowadays with open source software. I truly believe that. But having to route the traces from the system on a chip to the memory with KiCad was a little bit of a pain, because all of those traces, they need to be exactly of the same length. And if the tool that you use that doesn't help you into doing that, you will end up losing 2 weeks of your life into making sure that all of these traces are of the exact length. Especially when making the actual hardware is expensive and you cannot just ask for one board, you really want that all the tolerances in distances are very, very, very small. So we went to have all traces of exactly the same length. So we know margin there. And these are the traces that we use on 2 layers from going to the sock to the RAM. Very recently, KiCad announced support for length match tracing on these kind of traces. So I wish I had that last year. But at this point in time, I think it is actually easier to do this kind of process, and you don't have to do it manually. On the other hand, the 3D view of KiCad works excellent. It's very nice. It's not very useful, but it is way better than most commercial software, to say. So this is one thing that the open source software gets much better. So this is the alpha board that we first produced, which luckily worked right away. So there were only a few changes that we needed to do. So it had a JTAG connector that would allow us to debug the state of the CPU in case something would go wrong. We actually didn't end up using it, but it works just fine. On the final revision, we have the paths for JTAG. They're actually on the board, on the bottom of the board. So if someone wants to use JTAG for doing whatever, then it is still possible to do. And I think, again, it's pretty amazing that this can be done completely with open source software, and that in the size of that now we can have a full computer which is more powerful than a Pentium 2, which was that big. I think it's pretty amazing. We come a long way in terms of open hardware. So we had the alpha board there with the JTAG connector. We actually made 7 different beta revisions in the same panel. So we produced them all at the same time. And they all had little variations in order to identify which components we could spare, if we could use lower price components. The main idea was to actually reduce the overall production cost of the board, and we added the LED and so on. And finally, with the first production version, the Mark I, we have the final design that is actually being produced and shipped. One of the very interesting lessons in making this, and while it's important to test all of these kind of things before making 1,000 boards, there were a few inductors in the very first version that would simply fall off the board after 2 weeks of just taking the board and gently putting it on a table. So there were components that were really not meant to be touched at all after being soldered. And it wasn't the actual soldering that was failing, that was fine. It was actually the inductor component was just, breaking apart after a while. So luckily we found that right away, and then we changed our inductors with a different model, completely awesome. They are cheaper, they're more efficient, they have a nice shape. I could make a half-an-hour talk about the new inductors that we've chosen, which is a very nice example of how making hardware corrupts your mind, because you get excited about these things, right? You're like, oh, this tiny inductor has an hexagonal shape. Isn't that cool? But no one will notice. But anyway, I think it's pretty interesting. Lesson learned number 2. This was very tricky, actually. For the beta boards, we put selective gold plating on the USB connectors, which is essential because otherwise you will plug it in and out like 50 times maybe, and then it won't work anymore. So you need gold plating to ensure that you get many, many cycles. And the way the gold plating is done is that the manufacturer, which does the gold plating, will add traces to the board, which we didn't put in our project. So the manufacturer added them to add the anode and the cathode for doing the gold deposit. And in the very first version, you can see that there are the 4 USB pads, and then we have traces coming out on the edge of the board. Now, what happened there is that every time we would plug the board in, we would get exactly a 5-second delay before the bootloader would start. So when you get this precise delay in hardware, there's only one thing that you can do. You search in every datasheet that you have for the words 5 seconds, because it means that there's some component there which is enforcing that very specific timeout. And it turned out that the power regulator has a 5 seconds delay in case under voltage is being detected. So the question was, why do we have under voltage every time we plug the device in? And the reason was that by cutting the board where these traces go out, we have 4 little conductive dots over there which make connection to the USB connector before the pads are reached. So it means every time we would insert this into a plug, we would have an initial connection here, which would be lost from the distance that goes from this point to actually reaching the pads. So we would have connection, disconnection, and connection again, every single time. And that would cause an under voltage detection on the power regulator. And so by simply taping this area, we would see that the problem is not there anymore. So in the final version, we asked the manufacturer to do the gold plating by using these 4 pads instead of doing it this way. But it was very interesting to see a problem which is introduced by the manufacturing process, not by our design. And it was very difficult for us actually to debug and understand this. It took about 2 days to realize what was going on. But I think it was a very interesting and unique problem that we had. And so with the new configuration, this doesn't happen anymore. So this is the full board. So we have the micro SD card on the bottom, which acts as the disk. There's no other storage on the device. There's no persistent storage on the system on a chip, with the exception of a few bits that you can fuse for secure boot keys and so on. Here we have the LED. This is 0.5 gig of memory, and here we have the pin header and the USB connector over there, and everything else, it's all power related, and we have the 2 crystals over here, and these are the JTAG test points that we just put there in case somebody wants to use them. So I mentioned TrustZone. So TrustZone is a technology which is there, implemented in the ARM core and in the SoC peripherals. So with TrustZone, every single peripheral that is on the system on a chip needs to be TrustZone aware. It means that there's an additional discrete going from the peripherals between the bus and the core, which will assert if that device is in secure state or non-secure state. And you actually get to configure that. Of course, you need code for doing all of this. So we got very recently, 2 weeks ago, official support into the Gnode OS framework for the USB Armory. So now it is possible to compile Gnode OS in a way that Gnode OS, which is a microkernel-based operating system, would be placed in the secure world, and a normal Linux kernel minimally patched for running into normal world, then gets executed into the normal world. And it's a nice framework for then developing other applications, and GNodeOS provides you with the microkernel and all the functions that you need for adding your own code. The way it is set up right now is that half of the memory goes to GNodeOS and the other half of the memory goes to Linux. So we have 512 megabytes. So by running Gnode this way, 256 goes to Gnode and 256 goes to Linux. But this, of course, can be changed. And with Truston, you can decide arbitrarily how much memory should go to the secure world and how much memory should go to the non-secure world. We also have an example of using Truston directly, so without any microkernel, so by just placing the minimal amount of code in the secure world. And one of the examples that we make just to show what you can do is to set the LED on and off. And the way you do it, you basically ask, in this specific system on a chip, because here we're talking about things that are hardware specific, the so-called CSU, which is the Central Security Unit, we can decide to assign specific hardware subcomponents, as I was mentioning before, just to the secure domain. So if you want to take ownership of the LED, for instance, we need to get the correct GPIO, in this case it's GPIO 4, and ask to the related entry in the CSU to please put it into secure mode. The same thing needs to be done with the I/O multiplexer, because if certain paths can be shared by other functionality, so that's also required, so the normal world then cannot reconfigure the paths to other users, because that would allow you to bypass Truston. And then we do other things that didn't fit in a single slide, of course. We can also decide to use the internal RAM of the system on a chip, just for the secure zone, for the secure word code. So if the code can use the, let's say the 256 kilobytes of RAM, which are in the system on a chip, then you don't even need to take something away from the 512 megabytes of the DDR, which you can entirely give up to the normal world. And then we have the secure monitor handler. So the secure monitor handler is the piece of code which will be executed in secure world as soon as the normal world decides to raise the SMC call, which I showed you before. So with Truston, you can either decide to time share the two words. You can have an interrupt which will context switch between the two domains constantly. Or you can also decide to have the secure word silent and sleep in there, and then the normal word would just switch to the secure word whenever it needs to. So both approaches can be used. But in any case, we will go through the secure monitor. So this secure monitor is really simple. What it does, it compares if the word in the R10 register is cafe in hex, and if it is, it will just go to the SMC handler. Otherwise, it will go back to non-secure. And in the secure monitor handler, what we just set the direction of the GPIO, which is related to the LED, to output, and then we just toggle its state. So with this code, every time we would jump to secure code, we would either switch the LED on and off depending on its previous state. And this is the code that runs into Truston and then into the normal world. So this is an example for a Linux kernel module. This is the function beg for LED switch. So this is a privileged kernel module on Linux, which what it does, it will put the cafe word into the R0 register, and then it will just execute the SMC call. So by executing the SMC call, right away we have a context switch to the secure word, and then the secure word can decide to inspect all the registers and decide to take action. And so in this way, from the normal word, we switch to the secure one, and we ask for the LED to be turned on. Of course, this is the most trivial, the simplest possible implementation of an example of Truston support, and it's not really useful. But you can think that in the secure world you can put arbitrary code of your choice. So you can put encryption, decryption, you can put control of the hardware, which can then be requested by the normal world, and the secure world can decide upon whatever condition that you might like to act upon that request or not. One of the other things that we develop, of course, is because even if this is a standard Linux computer, so any software that's out there that can be compiled for Linux on ARM works. So there's nothing special about it. Think about any Linux distribution, any software that can run on it, it can also run on the USB Armory. But nonetheless, we wanted to, we think it's very important for certain security features to be easily available to anybody that wants to use them. Even file system encryption doesn't necessarily need to be used only by people that know what SSH is and stuff like that. So we wanted to make file system encryption easy to use on the USB Armory and possibly other devices. So we developed an application which is called Interlock, which is an open source file encryption front end, which while it has been developed for the USB Armory, it can of course be used on any other device. There is nothing which is specific to the USB Armory in this software. It's open source, and what it does, it provides a web-based file manager that can be used with the Linux Unified Key System encrypted partition system. So the idea is to have a front end that easily allows you to unlock and lock an encrypted partition running on the device, and then to also perform additional symmetric or asymmetric encryption on the files that are stored on the encrypted partition. And also, it provides, by using the Lux system, it provides some nice features like disposable passwords. So passwords that can be used only once, and even if they are intercepted in the moment of use, they are disposed right away, so they're useless after that. Or things like the nuke option, where you can just have a specific password, and if you type that, it will completely erase all of the files that are on the encrypted partition and make it unusable. So we're kind of falling back to the first example and the first original idea that we wanted to implement on this device. And this is the software that we hope will allow us to implement all the functions that we want. The design goals for this application were a few, but simple but important. So we wanted to have a clear separation between the presentation layer of the web application and the server layer. This is for multiple reasons. So first of all, we developed in the past and we audit all the time a lot of different web applications developed with all kinds of frameworks. And we realized that every time you develop a web application, no matter which framework you're going to use, at some point you will have to touch HTML and JavaScript. There's no web application framework that completely abstracts that away. Because even if they try, at some point you will need some functionality which it's not there in the framework, and so you need to know all these things. So we wanted to completely delegate the presentation to pure static HTML and JavaScript, which gets loaded by the browser, and to have the server side as a complete independent server which just implements a clear API between the two layers. And having a clear API between the two layers also helps in auditability, because you can see exactly how the server side is being used. And that's where your security domain is, the presentation and the server. So by defining an API, which is very well defined and simple, and having the presentation layer done in pure HTML and JavaScript, we think it suits well these kind of applications. And also the server can have a minimal footprint. I mean, this device, of course, as I mentioned before, is very powerful, but we still want to have a single nice binary that we can run without too many dependencies. So it was also important for us to have a minimal footprint on the USB Armory itself. And we want to support, as I said, Lux encrypted partitions, and then at least support OpenPGP for asymmetric ciphers. And for symmetric ciphers, we chose an AS256 OFB, but of course we can expand and implement more ciphers in the future. So the application works this way. We have the client browser, which loads from a web server all of the static content, which is served statically, so there's nothing special there. And then we have the interlock server, which implements a JSON API. So the JSON API provides multiple features. This is just a basic example. So the client browser logins with a JSON request. If the right credentials are being passed, we unlock the encrypted partition right away. So the authentication process of the tool is directly tied to the encrypted partition. That's the way we authenticate the user. If the user can unlock the encrypted partition, then we consider it to be a valid user. And then we respond back. Then we can ask, for instance, to encrypt a file which is already present on an encrypted file system, but let us say that we need to download this file and then share it with somebody. So first of all, when we log in, we can also decide to dispose of the password as soon as it is being used. So even if someone is intercepting that request, then the password cannot be later on used to unlock the encrypted partition on your device if it gets stolen, for instance. We can ask the interlock server to encrypt the file. So this is completely done on this device. That file never goes, it is never transmitted to the actual, to your laptop or to your host computer. And then we can download the encrypted file from the application. So I'm going to show you a demo here. So first of all, this is how I can talk to the device. So now I just SSH'd into my USB device, which I think is pretty cool. So it's a normal Linux system, as you can see, running Debian. So this is now stored on my USB device. I have the interlock application here. So the interlock application, the server is written in Go. The reason why we use Go is because it's fast. It implements all of the HTTP, HTTPS, and OpenPGP and cryptographic code that we want into its standard libraries. So we don't have any external dependencies. And the way Go works, you get a static binary which has everything in it required to actually launch the server, which is perfect for running on such an embedded system. You just get one binary, you execute it, and you're done. There are no other dependencies whatsoever. So I can start the server here, which I now started. So we have a few configuration values where we set certificates, the path to the keys, and so on. And I have an encrypted partition on my USB Armory, which is not mounted right now. So what I can do, I can just use the browser. So I'm on Windows here because I use it for presenting. Because one of the most complicated problems in IT is using a projector. And this is the only thing that Windows does better than Linux, I feel. So now what I can do, I can log in. And as you can see, I could tick that checkbox, and that would dispose of my password as soon as successfully used. So now it's unlocking the partition. It unlocked the partition. We can see here in the logs, so unlocking encrypted volume, and it also adjusted the time of the device. So the USB Armory doesn't have a battery. So one of the things that we can do with this web application, as soon as we log in, we can actually ask the browser to send the time to the server. And so the USB Armory can also set its own time so that the timestamp and everything are correct. And here I have the contents of my encrypted file system. So this is just like a file system manager. And what I can do, so I can decide to encrypt a file. So I can encrypt a file. I can decide to encrypt it with a symmetric cipher. And then the file gets encrypted. So now this file has been encrypted. I can decide to delete the original file. I can also decide to decrypt it again if I want to. Yeah, worked. And so this happened all on the external device. So my laptop doesn't know anything right now about all of these files. It's just being used as a client for this application. I can also decide to encrypt with an asymmetric cipher, so I can use OpenPGP, which again is implemented using the Go OpenPGP library. We don't actually use the GPG or whatever OpenPGP binary or external application. This is all done by this single application. So we can select the keys So there's a system that allows you to upload whatever key that you want. So now I encrypted it with PGP, and I can also decide to decrypt it. So I do have the secret key for that here. And then I decrypted the file, and I can also decide to download the encrypted file. Pop up, and now the file is being downloaded. I can also decide to download a directory if I want to. It's just going to be zipped and then sent to me. And I can decide to I can easily drag and drop files onto this thing. So let's try that, see if it works. So I have the presentation. Let me delete it from the Armory, and I can just drag and drop it. So now it's uploading. We see the progress there. And now the file is there. So we can easily drag and drop. We can also drag and drop a directory if we want to. Let me try that. So I have this directory here. Yes. So that is just going to upload. We get a log of everything that's happening on the server side is being logged so that you know exactly what goes on. And the directory is now there. So we use the device kind of in the same fashion that we would use a normal flash drive, but we have so much more going on. We can authenticate to the device. We have an encrypted partition on the USB device itself. We can perform additional encryption operation on the device, and then we can get the files out. And all of this is done with open source hardware and open source software. And here we can also decide to add other passwords. So I can add an additional password to this volume. So I need to put a valid password. And then I can put a new password. So, and now I provision the encrypted partition with an additional password. And so you can have a disposable password, so you can have a master password that you remember, and you can have a disposable password, and then every time you use the disposable password, you can add one again, or then you can also remove a password and so on. If you remove the last password, the last valid password, then the encrypted file system is permanently locked out, and you cannot access it anymore. And if I log out from the application, now the encrypted file system is locked. So on the device, actually, it's not mounted anymore. One of the other things that I can show you right now, of course, I'm running on Windows. I can also decide, so I have an X server running on the USB Armory. So one easy thing that you can do is you can simply use it as a Bitcoin wallet if you want to. And there you have it. So this is a Bitcoin wallet, which is running on Linux. This is an Electrum 2.0. I think it's written in Python. And it's just being exported. Its graphic is being exported tunnel over SSH and exported to the X server running on my Windows machine. So setting up this example took 10 minutes once we had the hardware. So I think it's another use case for having a computer which is this powerful on such a compact form factor. You can pretty much implement all kind of other functionality on the device. Where's the presentation? Yeah. So that was my presentation about the USB Armory and the software. The software has been the interlock software has been published very recently, a few days ago. So it's available on GitHub as with all of the schematics and sources and design files for the actual hardware. And we hope to get feedback about the tool. If new functionalities require new encryption ciphers or more exotic capabilities, I mean, we'll be very happy to implement it. And yeah, thank you very much. And I'm ready for questions. Any questions? Yes? Yes. So, okay. So the question is how the chain of trust works on the IMX53. No, we're not. So what we're going to do, so this is not out yet, but we're going to publish it, I think, next month. We're going to make tools that allow you to provision your own public key hashes on the MX53. This is really important for us. So we're not talking about secure boot like a PC where you have OEM keys pre-installed on. The secure boot on the IMX53 has no keys by default, and we certainly don't want to fuse them for you. You're going to get the device. So there are two options here. The first one will be that you will get the device with blank, with no, there are 4 slots for public keys. You will fuse them on your own, and we will provide tools so that you can easily sign the bootloader with your own keys. So that's the goal. And one of the other options that we're thinking of, which we think is pretty interesting, when you purchase the device from us, you can tell us the public key hashes, and then we fuse them for you. So that you know that even in transit, nobody can execute code on it. Not even we can do it because we just have your public key. So that's the idea. And we can also plan to make it in the order page. You just put the hashes there. But in order to do that, we need to test the process extensively because if you mess it up, you break the device. It is not like a PC where you can reset the secure boot state. I mean, once it's fused forever, which is a good use case for such a device, because if you lose the device, you don't want anybody to be able to just reset the secure boot state, because otherwise it's useless. So this is permanent, and that's the way it works. You have other fuses, like generic purpose fuses, that you can also use for your own keys. So you can use Trust Zone with secure boot in combination with these other fuses to then use your own key in there, which you know by hardware that nobody can ever read. Because only your own secure booted code will be able to read your own fused key on the generic purpose fuses, and so you can also have some kind of persistent storage on it for other uses. There is also a SOC-specific encryption-decryption key, which is burned by Freescale, which you can use, and you can use it in a way where you supplement the other half of the key yourself. And one of our plans is to use that encryption-decryption in a way that not only knowledge of your password is required to decrypt the files, but also your specific device is required. And that's one thing that we're thinking of leveraging on. Thank you. Question? No. There are no default certificate on it. The only thing that's provisioned on it by default is a minimal ROM, which is the one that actually has to detect if you're booting from USB or from micro SD card and so on. The secure boot has no private content from Freescale. The only thing that Freescale provisions is a symmetric key for encryption decryption on the security coprocessor, which you can decide to use or not, if you want. That has nothing to do with secure boot, and that you can also use, as I mentioned, with the other half of the key on your own. Any other questions? Oh, yes, it is for sale. And if you can also make it on your own. If you make more than 100, then from a commercial perspective, you don't lose money. But yeah, it's for sale. So on the website, all the details are available for getting one. Any other question? No? Well, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.